to everyone who's currently on and going to be hopping on for coming to our panel discussion about understanding belonging. We are very privileged to have four subject experts, Tavon, Shawnta, Aarti, and Omar, who will provide an insightful discussion on belonging. So let's just give them a round of applause in advance for them saying yes to having this discussion. And I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to you, Aarti.
Thanks, Milan. I like to be called a panel expert. I am no expert on this matter, but I'm excited to be having this conversation with everyone here and learning from them. My name is Aarti Sahgal, and I am the founder of Synergies Work and Synergies Seed Fund. Synergies Work is the largest startup hub supporting entrepreneurs with disabilities, and Synergies Seed Fund is the first financial organization directed towards providing affordable and accessible loans to people with disabilities and bringing them into the economic mainstream. But my biggest and the best hat that I wear is that of a mother. I have two sons. The first one is in a fintech startup, and the second one also runs two businesses, and he has Down syndrome. So that's my introduction, and I would love for Tavon, Shawnta, and Omar to introduce themselves about the work they do and what brings them to that work.
Sure, I can go ahead and jump right in. My name is Tavon Barnswell. I am a DEI practitioner. I have been one in an official capacity probably for about 6 years now. What brought me to the work unofficially was just really having a lot of microaggressions happen towards me, a lot of discrimination practices, things like that. And when I realized that DEI was an official role to help make sure that other people don't go through the same practices or go through the same incidences, then I jumped right on that. DEI is can be very reactionary in terms of when organizations want to put dollars in it. So of course, you might have noticed after the murder of George Floyd, a lot of companies then put some money behind it. Now with the attacks on affirmative action last year, there have been a lot of defunding of DEI over the past year. So it really is a pendulum swing, but until that swing comes back around where organizations are comfortable putting dollars back in it, I'm still fighting the good fight and trying to work with organizations to make sure that everyone has an equal opportunity to succeed no matter what their background is.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Omar.
Thank you. Tavon, thank you so much for sharing that. Wonderful. And also Aarti. My name is Omar Lebron. I'm a military veteran. I retired in 2014, active duty the whole entire time. I've been in HR since 1999, and I'd rather tell you the year that I've been in HR than to carbon date myself. It gets a little scary once I start saying I've been in HR this many plus years. But it resonates a lot of what Tavon was speaking about and what brings us together inside the DEI space, inside the DEI conversation. I myself, I'm a director of employee experience over for a not-for-profit called SelfHelp Community Services here in the greater part of the New York City metro area. I cover areas such as DEI as well as PCTI, which is Person-Centered Trauma-Informed Initiative, as well as HR training initiatives. Some of the reasons that I could tell you that highlight for me what makes this work very important, very impactful, is that it impacts the lived experience for a person on a daily basis. But more importantly for me, it's what happens the next day that keeps you choosing to return back to us, back to work, back to the workplace. That means that we're doing something right in face of the many challenges that we could get incorrect. And that happens quite often. And a part of that is understanding the complexities for us, and for me, particularly, especially, of how culture works, the relationship with leadership and those being led, as well as how you can best reach your best potential. So a lot of thought process goes within it while we focus on policy, equitable policies, training, to say the least, and how do we tie that together within that conversation in that sphere. And so I'd like to turn it over to Shawnta, who is our last, I think, on the panel.
Yeah, thank you for your service, Omar.
Yes.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing. Thank you for your service, and so nice to be here today. My name is Shawnta Hooks, and I am here in Atlanta, Georgia. I actually spent 20 years of my career working in corporate accounting and compliance, but I left that career about 5 years ago to really start my own business as a workplace belonging and culture expert and strategist. Which is really the work that I do is rooted in helping organizations enhance their experience with belonging through mindfulness and meditation specifically. The reason mindfulness and meditation is because I had my own, really life-changing and life-altering transformative experience with meditation back in 2019 that took me on this really interesting journey where went from being a student to being a teacher. And really helping people in the company that I worked for at the time, Synchrony Financial, understand how to use mindfulness and meditation to enhance their employee experience. Instead of just waiting for the employee and the circumstances to change, actually, what can you do on the inside? What is the inner work that can be done to shift your perspective, to shift your reactions or non-reactions, your ability to observe more and react less, to shift between reacting and responding. And all of this deals with your sense of belonging and how you show up in the workplace. And it's really transformative and enlightening work. I think I've had at this point over 10 to 11,000 students go through my courses. And the reactions are usually that they get these aha moments where they have a deeper understanding of how they can be connected to their work. Even if it's not their passion, even if it's not their purpose, you can, in the shoes that you're in right now, be connected to the work that you do by simply enabling and enacting the present moment.
Oops, awesome. Thank you for sharing that, Shante. At least we have one thing in common. My life also, I changed my career paths when my younger son was born, from being in the advertising and marketing for 14 years. And I'm dating myself here, Omar, and then moving on to the disability community, because for me, I was unable to understand why there are two worlds that exist amongst us, one for people with disabilities and one for the rest of the world. So since I'm been tasked with this great opportunity to moderate the panel, so I'll ask the questions and we'll just go around and have a conversation around that. What does belonging really mean to you, and especially in the context of disabilities and inclusion, and why is it so important today in the workplaces? Anyone wants to jump in? What does really belonging mean?
You can start. So yeah, because the focus of my work is belonging, I approach it from sort of an academic perspective. And there was actually some research done by this organization called CoQual, and I'll drop the link in the chat. They define belonging as how you show up in an experience of being seen, heard, connected, supported, and proud of your organization. And so I really leverage that definition, for me, particularly being seen, being valued, being supported, and feeling connected to my work. That's how I define belonging.
Okay.
Yeah, very well said. Not much, we could expand from there, but it's a really good source and baseline to start with. Certainly being seen and feeling that way for the uniqueness of who you are is certainly part of that belonging as well. And sometimes, of course, in this particular space, we're talking about disability, but for many of us, depending on our ethnicity, our background, and nationality, that can mean a lot of different areas and spaces that, who you are and how you show up to that workspace and how they are accepting that voice that you have, that you project, is very part of that definition of belonging. And of course, I would tie that together with psychological safety. That a company's and an organization's responsibility to make sure that they are also committed to providing what is that psychological safety, that feeling of showing up and not feeling castigated or in any negative way you're going to get impacted because of your point of view, your set way of doing things, of how you bring that unique self to work. And lastly, I would say that ties together with trust inside that organization. It's almost as three, but it's really one. That belonging, psychological safety, and trust, and definitely that helps impact your true experience inside of that workspace and why you again, to my original statement, why you come back tomorrow, or that intention to not leave the job?
For me, I think belonging is the most basic of human needs. It's like as basic as getting your food and shelter. And we say, I didn't coin this phrase, but I know for a fact also, loneliness is the only real disability, really. And people with disabilities, I can tell you, are the most extremely lonely people, and isolated. And because we are always approaching them from the point of view of, hey, what's wrong with you? How can I fix you? And if I can't fix you, where should I put you? And what should I do with you? It's not the positive, person-centered way that you're looking at. So really the sense of belonging is about social contacts. Like if it is in the workplace or outside, who are the people that I can rely on? Who will come to me when I need help? Who is in my circle of support? And that, I think, is very critical, whether it is in workplace or otherwise. That's what I take from what belonging really means to me.
Can I just add one thing to that as well? That all great points. And the only thing I want to add to it is about accommodation as well, and how accommodating and the changes that an organization will make to ensure that people not only feel like they can be themselves, but also actually can act that out. We always talk about, a DEI is about not just about being invited to the dance, but be invited to dance once you're there, but also being very specific about how wide is that doorway for people to even get into the room. What do the seats look like? What is the music like? All of the things of saying, not just, okay, we want to create a space where you can be yourself, but how can we make those changes and adjustments to ensure that you have all the resources that you need to be able to thrive on an equal level as everyone else.
And I think the equity conversation will begin with that. First, how do we ensure that we are bringing the right people into the room? Because even that selection process is sometimes walked. Speaking for people with disabilities, I can say that because of our biases and the mindsets that we have, there are certain jobs that we think that a person with a disability can do, whether it is, the front end, food service or janitorial, and certain jobs are not meant for them. So that itself, how do we ensure that we can change that? So my question really is that what are organizations doing then to build a sense of belonging for people with disabilities in their workspaces?
Yeah, one thing that I want to share a quick story that I think will be helpful for people. So my father was actually disabled. He had multiple sclerosis, which is a disease that impacts your central nervous system. And it forced him into early retirement from a career as an architect working for Chrysler. And once he started to learn to live with MS, and this is back in the 90s, where we were definitely not having conversations like this and about accommodation, so much so that, he eventually retired and he rode a motorized scooter and was riding his motorized scooter to the local YMCA one morning to go swimming. And because the roads were not accommodating to him, meaning the ramp, to get on, from one street to the next, he was riding his scooter in the street and unfortunately got hit by 3 cars. And he survived this, believe it or not. He survived this accident and unfortunately lived the next 14 years of his life, pretty much a paraplegic, bedridden, and he eventually lost his battle. He lost his life back in 10 years ago. I tell that story because it speaks to how important accommodation is. Accommodation in the workplace, now obviously I'm talking about in a public space, but the same goes for your ability to feel accommodated in the workplace. And oftentimes, and because I am a meditator and I actually picked up my skill of meditation from my father, who was also a trained martial arts expert. He traveled the world and practiced martial arts, and through his learning, he took up meditation. And meditation absolutely kept him centered through some of the darkest moments of his life. And it gave me an ability and him to have more of a neutral mindset, just so that you can see things as they are. And so for us in the workplace to kind of, segue this into why am I telling this story today? Well, in order for you to know how to accommodate, you have to be able to see a need for accommodation. And oftentimes the reason we don't see other people's needs is not because we have some sort of ominous intention or we're being discriminatory. Sometimes it's simply because we're not being present. We're so consumed with our own lives, our past thoughts, our future thoughts, our pain, our frustration, our happiness, our joy. We're so self-consumed that we fail to see what is needed for the other. And so if you can think about that in the text of accommodating people with disabilities, in the context of being a leader and knowing what your team needs, in context of being an employee and knowing how to communicate with your superior or with your mentors, right? The present moment is the moment where we get the information to know what is necessary. And that is especially important when we're talking about showing up for people in the workplace that that identify as having disabilities.
Might I begin by saying thank you for sharing. What a wonderful story to share, and his memory certainly lives on right here in this space today. So thank you for that. You hit so many points that were so hard on and so in depth that I think maybe we could even stay right on that same topic and in those same areas of what you had just spoken about. Those spaces that we have, the physical spaces, are equally so important, when you look at disabilities, because disabilities, number one, to Aarti's point, some things are seen, some things are unseen, some things are declared, some things are not, whether you identify with being disabled or not in the space. And the workspace can begin to have these kind of categorized judgments upon what you can and cannot do in the spaces and how productive you could really be. So even in the topic of being your best self at work, which is that rudimentary part of that baseline of belonging, right, with your relationships with your peers, your coworkers, and your seniors, as well as your leaders and your supervisors, the physical space is equally as important to understand how the topic of accommodation and the equity nature of it, how important and how impactful it is. Everything from the sizes of the elevators to get in, to the exits, if you have to get out, to your desk spaces, whether or not they lift or not, whether you could stand or not. Maybe you have, something that ails your body physically in some sense. Again, declared or not, seen or unseen. Our organizations being vigilant, visible, and instead of it being a token, it's very important to be committed inside the conversation of that space to make sure that the easy answer of no is never the one that we resort to. The easy answer of it's not just a accommodation, right? It's called a reasonable accommodation. However, that reasonable part can allow an area of a negative answer so quickly, right? When we should be supporting our staff, and we should be understanding what it is that they're going through, when we can definitely learn to accommodate so that they could bring what they engage in their workspaces in a productive nature so that we can get across where we have to get to. And it takes a commitment. I have seen everything from organizations, hiring folks in a deliberate, in an intentional nature, expanding their roles to disability, folks who have declared disabilities, let's just say, let's put it that way, which is a protected class, right? You cannot deny them their right to work inside the workspace. However, even in being such a conscientious, good example of opening up the doors, how ill-prepared they were to understand the nuances of the relationship, the accommodation, and everything that you had to answer leading through, right? And I could tell you, just looking at some of the specifics, some percentages in the workspace, my own workspace, right? 68% have no diagnosis of a disability, right? 26% decline to answer. Here's the kicker. The average 1 or 2% either have some sort of mental health or learning disability or some sort of impairment. Very low percentage just declaring themselves to saying, what do I have? And this is the reality of just one specific workspace. And so as an organization, to answer your question, Aarti, what are we doing? First of all, we cannot shy from the conversation. We cannot shy at all from holding and understanding, we have these policies in place, we have these protected classes, but it's far too easy to say, no. How do we hold ourselves accountable inside those spaces, inside the language of those set policies, but looking at the physical space and looking at the physical reality that affects a person who goes to work rightfully, and how do we protect that and continue to make sure that we not only protect that, but allow a space that lets them thrive and lets us thrive. Because when we each thrive because of our said differences, we are stronger, we are better, we are vastly more productive in touching more areas than we ever have touched before.
Tavon, you have something to say?
Well, I mean, it's hard being on a panel with great orators and people that just just hit the nail on the head and then have to go third after those people. So, but I will just say it, just kind of add from a different lens as well. Being in the DEI space, a lot of times, like you go into it with a passion, you really hope that people know that it is the right thing to do, right? To make people feel included, to make people feel that they belong, to have a diverse group of people working for you. But a lot of times you come up to the hurdle of people that need a business case for it, right? And say like, but what really is the point of us putting these dollars towards making certain groups of people feel more comfortable if we can, like Omar said, just do the easier route, which is just to say no and just keep it moving. The business case for being more inclusive as well is that it does help the bottom line. When you think of it like I think of the YMCA story, and I hate that happened. And I just think of so many other customers that YMCA could have had that probably they looked at how inaccessible it was to get to that branch and just said no. So that's dollars that the YMCA lost out on because they weren't accessible for a wider group of audience. I'm in the tech field now too, and like we talked about how disability is a wide range of different things. It's not just a physical disability. And I think of when I heard someone talking about being colorblind and presentations that are done in certain colors where someone is having a hard time following that PowerPoint presentation because the colors that are supposed to mean certain things aren't really being received and read well. Well, if you're creating an app and you realize, oh, wait, I didn't even think about color blindness, and I didn't even think about the thousands of people that have to deal with that. Let me not have my brand colors be this, or let me make sure that the colors on the app for certain things that we really want to highlight are not certain colors. So there is a business case for the more that we're inclusive internally, the more that we have people working on our teams that are diverse in terms of disability, the more then they will bring up things that our customers then have to deal with that we didn't even think about. Because although I'm a DI practitioner, I've never had MS, right? Like, I don't know what it feels like to be in a wheelchair and think about the potholes and the unevenness of the road trying to go down. I can try to read books all I can, but there are certain things I don't know. I don't know what it's like to be colorblind. So it is very important for us to make to go away from those easy no's and to really put those dollars into having people really feel psychologically safe and giving them a space and hiring them. We want to get them in, but then we also want to keep them, because this then trickles down to the bottom line, because now we have people that can then make sure that the product that we're creating, whether it be a service or an actual tangible product, is then more inclusive for the people that we serve.
And I just want to add one thing, Tavon, you said that so beautifully. I see we have a ton of amazing orators on this panel right now, but what you said, in terms of, I don't know what it feels like to be such and such, right? And this is where I think, the reason that I'm on this panel is to help everyone understand the role that, our connection and our connection to the present moment can help with that, because what you're talking about is empathy. Right. And that is a word that we're hearing more and more in the business space around how empathy enhances your ability to, it's really, if you want to kind of take it to to sort of a superhero kind of way, it's a superpower. It's a way for you to tap into psychic capabilities. If you want to look at it that way, it is your superhero, thing, empathy, because when you have empathy, you now are tapping into that space of you where you do know what it's like to, you can kind of feel what it would feel like to be in a wheelchair and ride over potholes, right? You can recall a memory that is similar to that neurologically. And we're not just talking woo-woo here. We're talking about neuroscience. We're talking about connections and neural networks being made in the brain that help you recall memories, millions and billions of memories and thoughts that come to the surface that help you remember what it's like to be different. And at the end of the day, that is what helps us enhance the workplace as it relates to disabilities. It's our ability to understand and respect our differences. And that's where it can get a little controversial. I can understand why people don't necessarily want to identify as disabled, right? Even though there's funding attached to it and all these other things, and there's a lot of conversation in this space of what is the right word. But beyond all of that, we all need to understand what are our abilities. And one ability that we all have is the power of empathy and the power of understanding so that we can serve others in a better way.
Yeah, I think that's really well said, Charlie, about empathy. That's something that we can all build. But to your point, Tavon, about the business case and for people to see uh, themselves in the organization from which they are buying products and services is very important, because this is a huge, unseen, underserved, largest minority in the United States. We are talking here about 1 in 5 people who self-identify as a person with a disability. And disabilities could be what Omar was saying, physical disability or a sensory disability, or it could be a mental health, or it could be intellectual disabilities. And they have the purchasing power, which till recently organizations have not brought up that question out. But when we see organizations tap into this talent pool, which is a very diverse talent pool, and there is intersectionality here also in this between disability and the other ways that we identify as human beings. But disability is like, not color specific or income specific. You can be poor, rich, yellow, green, purple, and still have a disability. So talking about that and having the purchasing power, but of organizations, as you said, if we don't see ourselves in the leadership roles or in the organizations that are serving us, we don't build that connection and empathy. And therefore, it is very important to see people with disabilities in the organizations, and for organizations to reach out and serve this population. That's important. And then beyond accommodations, I think accommodations are a huge part of the space and workplaces. And physical accommodation is very critical. I was reading the chat and I was seeing that someone mentioned how important it is to them as they navigate the workspaces. Generally, organizations, I believe, shy away from even hiring people with disabilities because they believe the accommodations price might be very high. But we know in this panel that an average cost of accommodation is less than $500. And whether I have a disability or not, but I do use a desk that allows me to stand and work, sit and work, and therefore it benefits the entire organization and not just one person whether we do curbside cuts, which might be for technically for people with disabilities, but pregnant women can also walk, or women with children can also use the curbside cuts for them. So accommodations benefit all of us. And what Omar was saying, the diverse workforce is a more innovative workforce for all of us. So yeah. So what are the I jumped into this, some common misconceptions that people have about persons with disabilities, and therefore that prevents them from building a sense of belonging in their organizations. And if you have ever supported a person with a disability, would love for you to share those experiences with the audience.
Thank you so much, Aarti, for the question, actually. I did want to, Tavon, I think that you left a very huge impact in something when you said, I don't know how it feels, ... right? That area. And how important, another area that you also brought up, Tavon, which is, the DEI conversation, why DEI exists, right? What is that initiative? What does it feel like? What does it impact the most? And one of the things that it does is it keeps the conversation where the conversation needs to be had. And whether that is at its dynamic, more direct impact, which is like supervisory relationship with their staff, or if it's with the CEO or any of the executive level branches that we each have and each share within our organizations, and why and how important it is, whether we identify with or oversee a build or a design inside of our workspaces, right, to properly accommodate, but how DEI lends itself to the continual conversation with weight, with empirical facts, with equitable returns and knowledge and understanding and perceptions of what we're intentionally working on, as opposed to an opinion or as opposed to a feeling of how I feel this person, a determination of how this person may or may not work out for us, which kind of segues into, Artie, your question. What are some of those things that are challenges that we reach inside of our organizations when it comes to that recruiting process, when it comes to that point of view of accepting the right to work for a person on a identified and declared disability? Again, some are seen and some are unseen, right? I come from a space I shared. I was a military member for 20 years, right? I come from a space that may lend itself to certain unseen disabilities that, I'm not wearing, certain parts of what maybe inhibits me or prohibits me from functioning in certain, aspects of my work or my job. However, how do we understand and work within a landscape of work performance that allows people to get a job when you do see that disability? And if we could be so bold in this conversation to go ahead and go into that seen disability, that one that gets prejudiced or gets judgment on and upon, when a person comes in, whether they're, have a color blindness, whether they have a handicap, a physical ailment that, makes them a handicap in some capacity, some form of utility that may be, stopping them from whatever you deem or you seem to have as a perception or a judgment. What are we doing inside those spaces to make sure that we allow that equal employment opportunity response that they should be having across that board? And I would say, I think that that's a challenge across the board, right? I think that that's something because people are the administrators of those decisions, not systems. Systems in and of itself say what the right behavior should be, what the right outcome should be. However, people still are those that are making those decisions ultimately, right? So a hiring manager, a hiring person will ultimately have to deal with understanding. And so one of the ways that we actually approach this is to continually train internally. And so we have a process of which that we have to decide, well, then who do you train and how do you train and what increments do you train? So as part of those HR initiatives that we hold inside of our organization, just to be a little more specific, because these are conversations that we have to have inside the DEI space and as well as inside that HR who's dealing with the recruiting aspect of it, is making sure that hiring managers, our leaders, our supervisors, our managers from anywhere in the hierarchy of where they are inside the organization, that we have a proper training system, that even if we don't have one now, that we have to continually think about skilling up in those areas. Because to the example of, I think I read somewhere, I'm not a psychology major, so I won't even pretend to be here, but I think I do recall reading that your first 6 to 8 years, of life develop that character of who you are in a lot of ways. So a lot of your inhibitions, a lot of your categories, let's just say, or even, stereotypes or not, are built and developed and devised. And so here we have, this adult Omar making decisions as a 6-year-old child, which should scare the heck out of everybody on this panel. You don't really want that 6-year-old Omar to do it. However, when we go on and we learn in our respective fields and we get our higher education and we sacrifice many times, or our parents have sacrificed to put us in a position to learn, we don't particularly always learn how to be the best supervisor, how to be the best leader, how to be the best manager. And so inside organizations, we have to understand and pick up those pieces, that although we're getting very skilled workers and whatever approaches of work that we have, that we provide services for, we have to bridge together what it is that we really want to experience inside of our organizations. So I'm a big believer inside training up inside the organization. And I have supported various staff members that have had identifiable and identified disabilities, to making sure that we seek the right accommodation and that we have the right amount of experiences that are culturally impacting them positively inside the workspaces. And I've also come across areas that, organizations, again, ill-equipped and ill-trained and ill-ready to take care of those very dynamic areas that, although you opened the door of an opportunity, you really fell short in what we were actually providing as a safe space, psychological safety, but also that space for productivity for the person. And so I could tell you, it's not fun when you fail in that landscape.
So for
Yeah,
us, yeah, go ahead, Shawnta,
I was just gonna say, Omar, I think we actually 6-year-old you as a decision maker is probably pretty powerful, because the reality is that when we are young, it's kind of dovetails into my answer to this question, we have less judgment. Children are actually, and actually, one of a big phrase in the mindfulness space is, sort of think with a childlike mind, to think with a beginner's mind. And what that means is to think from a perspective of non-judgment, and I haven't defined the word mindfulness yet, but mindfulness is paying attention on purpose without judgment. And the reason that I'm saying that is because I think one of the biggest misconceptions around this topic of disabilities is within the space of judgment, right? Those that have the disability constantly feel judged. And those that, may be working with people with disabilities may be judging them, right? And I think there are hiring statistics that speak to this, right? How often are people with disabilities hired or not hired? And even though it's illegal, we know that it still happens. And so this idea of judgment, perceived or real, because sometimes, you can feel that you are judged as someone that is a Black woman, don't identify as having a disability, but I have my hair in braids. I have jewelry on, right? There are many times where I have shown up in professional settings feeling judged. But then when I actually, get through that discomfort, right? When you really sit through that discomfort, that is at this point only perceived, because I don't really have any true substantiated data to support that I'm being judged. And when I have a conversation with someone and they get curious about my appearance and they ask me about my hair, they ask me about my jewelry, as opposed to being defensive to that, I am actually very receiving and accepting of it, right? I invite them in, I invite their curiosity in. And so I think one of the things that we all should lean into, a tool that doesn't require a dime, like it literally doesn't require a dime, but I think it requires an investment in our ability to be vulnerable, whether we are the person with the disability or whether we're the person that's supporting the people with disabilities. Sharing your stories, opening up about who you are, right? Everyone, I think all of us, and Artie spoke to the statistics, we all know someone at least who has been disabled, right, in our lives, in our personal lives. And so it's not a tall cry or tall order to say that you won't be able to relate to someone with a disability, even though their initial appearance may be uncomfortable for you, right? We're human beings, and I think that empathy and an ability to just understand that we all have feelings, we all have thoughts, we all have emotions, we all have reactions. And so if someone is uncomfortable with your physical appearance or your disability, as long as they're not disrespectful, maybe push through that discomfort. Because the reality is, when you learn to sort of train your nervous system to relax, because that's what we're talking about here. We need to all figure out ways to relax so that we can get into a space where we can share our stories authentically. The stories are the things that help us get to understanding. I looked up, why do we tell stories as human beings? And the simplest answer is because it helps us understand. And so when we tell our stories, when I tell my story about my dad, and it's hard. It's not the easiest. I was getting emotional just telling it just then. It's not the easiest story to tell, but I know that someone can connect with that. I know that someone can connect with having a parent or seeing someone in a wheelchair, having to literally stop their career, a career that they worked really hard to get, and being a Black man in Detroit, Michigan as an architect, and then having to retire early from that, right? The emotional toll that took on my dad, and the depression that he experienced, and the additional disabilities that he developed as a result of that one incident. It's a story that has a lot of reach, and people can see themselves in that story. And suddenly we're not so uncomfortable, and suddenly we're not so unable to connect and relate to one another. And once you sort of relax that nervous system and get into that ability to share your story, share your vulnerability, now you're in a space where you can relate to people differently. You're not othering them. You're inviting them in, and it becomes more than just disabilities. It becomes, now I'm relating to a Black woman with locks in a way that I never did before. I'm seeing that, she actually is a lot like me. Although we may have very different stories, this isn't about us all becoming one, because I don't believe in that. It's about celebrating our differences so that we can achieve understanding. So I think the most powerful tool that we can do, and I share my story often, that's my main domain of supporting people of all different backgrounds. But I would really encourage people to really work on their vulnerability so that they can share their stories and receive the curiosity and stories of others.
Great point. I just want to read one of the comments that has come up in the chat by May. Thanks, May, for sharing this. The problem is that people think it is an or situation, either a skilled qualified person or a person with a disability for a job, instead of recognizing that person with a disability is the most skilled and qualified person. I really love that statement for making that. But to your point, Shawnta, and to Omar's point, we do have biases, and we do. I think everybody has a bias. But what you were saying, mindfulness or being conscious of that bias, is the most important thing. And that is really critical, that yes, if I judge people, but as long as I'm conscious that I'm judging it, then I can make that difference. And in workplace, what you were sharing, Omar, that was so critical. For me as a person, we as an organization work with people with disabilities, and therefore we make sure that we hire folks with disabilities all the time. And I am learning through this work myself that sometimes asking simple questions and recognizing, providing constant feedback and asking them to tell me and to educate me, like, what are the things that are working for them, and also sharing what are the things that do not work for them, so that we are all on the same page, and then respecting things that don't work for them, or understanding what is going to trigger certain things that will prevent them from giving their best. So respecting and having those constant dialogues and understanding that is an important part for us, and listening. I think the most important tool that we can provide to anybody is the power of listening to folks, and that's most critical. Sorry, Tavon. Yeah, go ahead, please speak.
Yeah, I just I think about what everyone has talked about, and also Aarti, going to what you just said, hearing personal stories are super powerful, right? Like, we could have had this whole panel and not heard Shantae's story, and the fact that she shared her story has been super impactful, and I'm sure people will remember that as one of the things that they'll look back, and that'll be one of the things that they remember the most about this. One of the things I think about, like with Omar talking about different trainings and things like that, that I'm sure people at his organization goes through, really to take that up, or to extend that another step. One thing I'm used to doing at organizations are what's called courageous conversations. And that is a monthly conversation. I've done one on autoimmune disease. I've done one on suicide awareness. I've done these conversations where I have people from the organization talking about their personal stories with whatever their disability is. And it is really impactful when you realize that there's your colleague that's right next to you that is dealing with some kind of autoimmune disease, how that shows up in their daily life, what accommodations the organization has made for them, and what things that they wish were available to them. Disability, along with DI and a number of other words, have such a negative connotation when it really shouldn't. I know that we've tried to move as a collective from disability to differently abled, because essentially you're not any less than, like the comment said, you just have, you're just different then, so And thinking about that, realizing that people with disabilities are not less than. They're not. Disability is not a bad word. You're not. You just have different things that you need to be successful. But really, in those courageous conversations, not only was I doing things on autoimmune disease, but also how do you be your authentic self at work as an immigrant in the United States? You're not you technically don't have a disability coming in to the organization as an immigrant. You just have a different perspective and you have different needs. That is really the same thing as someone who's got MS or someone who has a different disability. You just have, you just look through things from a different lens and you just need different things to be successful. It's funny, we were going to talk about if one of us identified as having a disability, and I raised my hand, and really it wasn't only until, as much as I've been in DEI for years, I didn't view myself as having a disability until these last couple months as I've been looking for new roles. And that's because the questionnaire, when you're going through and applying for new roles, it asks you if you have a disability. And it lists a lot of things. And a lot of the things they list first are things that are physical disabilities. And I've noticed that coming towards the end of the list, because usually I would just scroll through and just hit no. And one time I slowly was like, just really like looking at it, and I saw PTSD on the list. And I was diagnosed with PTSD a number of years ago. And for me, the diagnosis has very much been, my life has started over and in a better way with that diagnosis, because I've been able to be more aware of that quote unquote disability. But I didn't realize that it was on the list of disabilities. So now I think about myself as technically a disabled person with an invisible disability. And what does that look like? I don't have the same physical needs as someone who may have a physical disability, but there are different things that I need for myself having PTSD in terms of how I interact with my manager and my boss, the words that they use, the way that they interact with me on a management basis. And this doesn't make me any less qualified. This doesn't mean that I am not as educated, that I can't do my job. It's just that I need what I need to be successful is just slightly different. And that's really what being disabled is, whether it be a visible or invisible situation. It's just that our accommodations or what we need to be is just slightly different. Just like if we were an immigrant, just as if we were a single parent or someone who is taking care of aged parents, all these things that just make us different. And I really hope that organizations will continue to, instead of looking at things with this negative connotation, because maybe things have been politicized or, there are all these misconceptions, that we really just realize what the whole point of this is just looking at each other's differences and what it takes to help us all be able to succeed equally.
I respect that, Tavon, but I do want to respectfully say that being disabled, as someone said, and being disadvantaged are two different things, absolutely different things. And yes, there are systemic biases when we are dealing with people with disabilities. And as I said earlier, there are folks who have intellectual disabilities. And how many people do we see with intellectual disabilities in our workspaces? We consider them as people who are going to be only doing janitorial work or bagging. And why is that the case? There are people, not just when we talk about disabilities and we are looking at physical disabilities, that forms a very small percentage of the entire disabled community. Okay, there are people with sensory disabilities. So there are differences. Yes, we need to be looking at making sure that we have those openness and the ability to bring people into the workforce at this time, but that is not happening. The diversity of the workforce is not happening because of various disabilities that exist, whether it is intellectual disabilities or autism or people on the spectrum. We put them into boxes and we deal with them. As a parent, I can share here that my son has Down syndrome. And when he was in 4th grade, it was decided that he would not be able to read beyond the kindergarten level, and that he was put into the system to learn community-based training. That's what it is called, basically, where you are going to go to various targets in the Walmarts, and they teach you to shop and navigate the community, but not teach you to educate. They don't take you to socially valued places that we request, like the banks or the library, or earn money. You only know how to spend money. Today, he goes to Georgia State University. We moved him out of the school system because there was a different thing. He goes to the Georgia State University IDF program. He's a junior there. He runs two businesses. One business is a tea business, the other is a tech platform. He was one of the 9 people who got selected out of 900 applications for Techstars Impact. So what's the difference here is that sometimes we are what I call the pegging and not raising the bar for people. It is the soft bigotry of low expectations, or our own judgment, which is telling people that because you have a disability, you can only do that. So how can organizations is, as Omar was saying, building that and Shawnta, you were talking about having that lens to see that how do we open our mind and how do we judge our own biases as a question. So I know we are short on time, 4:51, the last 10 minutes on the conversation. But really, what role does leadership can play, in your opinion, to make sure that we build to foster a culture of belonging for people with disabilities? And how do we ensure that they are represented in workforce?
Yeah, I can start with that since I'm off mute. I think first and foremost, let's just keep it real. It's investment. It's always investment. We need to invest dollars. The dollars create the programs that create awareness. The dollars create the accommodations. The dollars create the training programs. The dollars bring in speakers and educators like myself and the other brilliant facilitators and thought leaders on this call. We can't. You don't get the benefit of DEIB without the investment. Right. And that is just the way everything goes. And listening, someone just said in the chat, right? Teaching people how to listen. We take for granted, I think, where human beings are right now, on this day in 2024, where we are, especially post-COVID, right? We have all, technically, it's really interesting. I was really my mind was going to some interesting places with sort of a debate between like disability, disadvantage, the different words. And I was on the debate team in high school, so I was kind of imagining myself debating. But I'll say this one thing that I wrote, and I looked up the word disability, and it led to, essentially the reason that we call it a disability is because it potentially creates a disadvantage, perceived disadvantage. But the interesting thing is that post-COVID, a lot of us have disabilities, right? A lot of us have PTSD. A lot of us, have disabilities that are now actually coming to the surface that were just dormant, that we just never did anything with, right? So what happens in a society where we all recognize our disability, right? When we all claim it 100%, right? That's an interesting thought. But the truth is, the only reason that I say that is that we all need help, right? We all need help with returning back to listening, returning back to the present moment, returning back to connection, returning away from our phones, our devices, our disconnection of wanting to avoid people, right? And I know that the community that we're talking to right now is a lot of technologists. It's stereotypically, and I'm not trying to offend anyone, but stereotypically, and having worked in technology, I actually worked 2 years as a transformation leader where I managed technologists and coders using robotic process automation and other tools to automate processes. So I know very intimately what it is like to be a technologist and someone that really is a creative, that really zones in, and how that can show up as neurodiversity or being introverted or being, all these different labels. I'm not really a fan of a bunch of labels, but what I am a fan of is authenticity. And we as cultures and organizations and leaders need to invest in, especially in this post-COVID environment, invest in the people and the tools and the technologies that are really going to help us raise our level of consciousness to a place where we can all really collaborate together in a connected way. And that includes training, that includes, there are improv classes and people that teach improv classes just to organizations to help them be better listeners, right? We can get innovative, we can get creative. We don't just have to do things the same old way. That's the beauty of technology. Again, the beauty of mindfulness and meditation. It helps you improve your creativity and your innovative thinking, so that now we're not just bringing in the same old kind of training programs. We're changing things up so that we can have lasting impact, so that we can all deal with our collective disability of being a post-COVID survivor in 2024.
Well said. So well said, Shawnta.
Thank you.
Omar, Tavon.
Sure thing. Yeah, absolutely. And when I think of the question on what could leaders do inside those organizations, I'd say, first of all, they could be courageous, right? Secondly, be prepared. And thirdly, don't resort to having a tokenism or a token, okay? Because that leads to failure, let alone that it's the ultimate microaggression, right? It's the ultimate isolation. It's the ultimate toxic relationship that you could possibly foster, but what exactly does it mean to be courageous, right? I think we spoke about it earlier. Tavon, you have a great suggestion of what you do there, which is hold the tough conversation. That's being courageous, okay? Having an expectation to succeed instead of having the expectation in the opposite direction of what we can't do here. Tell me what we can do instead of telling me what we can't do. And that takes courage. I think a lot to Shantae's point in there. There's a lot of courage that it takes to hold that conversation, to have that active listening component to what you do on an everyday basis inside that relationship and inside that conversation, especially in the structure of the workplace. And I think being prepared is huge. And of course I can count it to number one. You got to have the same language of what are we talking about? What is the actual expectation, right? So you got to train to get there. That's number one. And organizations have got to commit to understanding that portion of it. But also it's holding an accountable measure, and accountable to what? A consistency, right? That the conversation about accommodation is not as it's a gray area, right? What is for me and what I need is different for what someone else may need. So you can't just loop it into a bucket and say, okay, this is what the policy says and this is for everybody. No, it's got to be person-centered and it's got to be work-driven. We've got to understand the differences, and you got to be able to measure that with consistency. And so, to answer your question, Aarti, I think, those are what organizations can commit to make sure that they're putting themselves in the right position to at least begin to understand the responsibilities that they have inherently to hire, to equally employ, and to succeed when you do hire folks with disabilities that are inside our workspaces, seen or unseen disabilities, both alike.
How powerful was that, Omar? Really nice. Tavon.
Yeah, I guess the short answer that I can give, and not to try to plug myself, but to say intentionality. And like we talked about, what we don't know. As much as DEI is getting really attacked right now, the whole point of DEI is intentionality and bringing in someone who can see things from a different lens, see different areas that are needed to be improved, see different places where represented and marginalized groups really need the most help. When Shawnta talked about, investment in dollars, that's one of the things we need investment in. If being inclusive was supernatural for everyone, then we wouldn't need DEI. If we could just all live our lives and not be biased and not have and not be inclusive, like that would just happen. But that's not the way of the world. And so we really need to take those dollars in and really invest in programs and really invest in people to be able to come in, even if it's on a consulting basis, to say, okay, we really want to make this space inclusive. We really want to to let it be embedded in everything we do, not just with our hiring.
Sorry, I was on a Zoom. I'm on a Zoom. I didn't.
So not just sorry, I lost my train of thought for a second, but not just but in all aspects of the organization, what our marketing looks like, what our people that are doing the coding, like, are they is everyone on those teams being included? Like, we really need to make sure that we continue to be intentional about making that effort, because these things unfortunately don't come natural, and that's understandable. But because it doesn't, we need to continue to put the work in until that day comes when every underrepresented or marginalized group can sit there and say, hey, are you okay over there? Yeah, we're good. We feel included. We've got our resources. How about you over there? And that group is like, yeah, we're good over here too. Unfortunately, probably that day will never come. And there will always be a group that feels like that they aren't supported like they need to be. So while we're on this journey to, like I keep saying, fight the good fight, that we continue to put those resources and those dollars, those programming, all of that, we have to be intentional, because this is not a problem that will solve itself.
Thank you so much. So yeah, such great points raised just now, what leaders can do to solve, create a place of belonging. I love the words, what you shared just now, Tavon, being courageous, being intentional, being mindful, invest in the organization to create a space which is welcoming to everybody. I would just like to say that, and this is really piggybacking on what Omar was talking about. He said, set expectations of growth and not just of tokenism. I think that is so, so important, that because sometimes ask the people what, look at it from a growth mindset, a positive mindset, and ask them what is their vision of growth, what is their dreams that they want, and see how we can accommodate and support them to reach that vision and fulfill that vision. Maybe also find regular time to pause and reflect with the employees and hear from them and listen from them what's working and what's not working, and hire people with more disabilities. And more importantly, I think the best thing that a leader can do would be to also ask very important questions to themselves, to find out what is bringing them to the work that they are doing. What can they do to invest in themselves? How are they listening? What are they listening to? And what are they believing of everybody? Because leadership is very critical. They play important roles in making sure that they are building the right organizations. And there is an old saying that we use in our world that we work, is that a person's needs are best met by a person whose needs are met. So if the leader doesn't invest in themselves, they will never be able to invest in the employees. So invest in yourself. Also take time to find out where you can do that. And if you go wrong, well, reach out to any one of us. We'll help you get back on track, right? So thank you so much for this conversation, and thanks to 48, Seema and Milan for inviting us for this. I thoroughly enjoyed myself today on this conversation.
Equally, thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Yeah.
Quite a pleasure.
If you all have any questions, we can open it up for Q&A while we have a few minutes left. So you can drop them in the chat, or you're more than welcome to come off mute. Maybe not.
That just means we did such a great job.
That's what I was saying.
Awesome.
I agree completely, guys. I agreed. You guys did a absolutely fantastic class.
job answering these questions and really giving us at least a place to start for our group. I don't know how many on our online actually know about belonging or where they are in that journey. Everyone is somewhere on the journey, I feel like, right? But I don't think we all know where we are sometimes. And I think the path is very long. I do have one quick question. And my question is, as most of us, or maybe I shouldn't say most of us, I know, Omar, you're in New York, Tavon, you're in Atlanta, and Aarti, you are. Shawnta, I'm not sure if you are local also to Atlanta, I believe.
Yes.
Right. So in our city, and I'll be very selfish, right? So in our city, in Atlanta, what work is happening here, and how can the local population, or let's just say our volunteers here at 4848 that are living in Atlanta, what is one thing that they could do to support the understanding and growth of belonging here, and maybe even from a, government perspective? Like, what could we do on a local level?
I could take. Oh, so go ahead, Shawnta.
Sure. I'll, of course, do a shameless plug. I have a community called the Stillness Loop that is local here to Atlanta, and it's free. It's a free community. I started this community back when I was working in my corporate job, and it grew to like over 500 people. And I create programming and send out information to help you understand mindfulness and how to bring it into your everyday life with an intention of enhancing belonging specifically. And so you can feel free to sign up. I just dropped the link to my website. Sign up to get on my mailing list, follow me on LinkedIn and as well as Instagram, because really, from my perspective, there are two ways that you can tackle belonging, right? It's from the inside and from the outside, and they both matter, right? I focus on the inside. I don't want to put words into Vaughn's mouth, but I know as a DEIB specialist, you want to, really impact the environment. And when the two go hand in hand, that's how we get true transformational, long-lasting transformation. That's through doing that inner work, honoring the pause, which is one of my personal mantras, but really, tapping into stillness so that we can get through these thoughts, these negative thoughts, these judgments, all of these things that are in our head that are stopping us from getting true inclusion, belonging, equity, and all the things that we're all working really, really hard to get in this world.
So my work, as you know, Seema, is working with entrepreneurs with disabilities and building, closing the net opportunity gaps that exist in our world, especially towards economic inclusion. And I think as organizations, as state, as cities where we belong, my dream is that we hire more people with disabilities. We build these inclusive spaces for them, whether it is hiring them or seeing them even in the startup world, because that's where Synergies work lives. How many entrepreneurs with disabilities do we see in Startup Atlanta in this ecosystem? Hardly anybody. Those conversations need to be brought up to the surface and see when we say that who else is missing at the table. And I say this all the time, that there is intersectionality between our work. Disability is one thing that is universal. Any one of us can enter this space anytime in a blink of an eye. And therefore, and yet, all of us have some kind of, probably don't even acknowledge it, as this panel shared, that we might have a disability because it has a bad rep in the world. And it's just definitely in the economic mainstream. So yeah, how can they support? Numerous ways you can support within the organizations, and you can support Synergies work and see the work we are doing, and which will not just to support us in one way, but to see, to get your mind open to the talent and the diversity of talent that exists in the community. That is what is required, is to give ourselves that opportunity to see that there is so much of talent in the disability community, which is untapped till now.
I would probably say, or not probably, because I'm going to say it, is to the cliche thing of you have to use your voice. both internally in your organization and also politically as well, you know, with your votes. For me, and I just saw the comment or the question about how do you get change in terms of, you know, the accessibility of switching over to Zoom when you say that your organization says that you're a Google shop, which I came from an organization. My last organization was very much that. They were, you know, we use Google products. This is what we use, blah, blah, blah. Again, it really sucks that you just being able to say something and share something that is the right thing to do doesn't invoke change in that person. So sometimes you have to continue to use your voice and speak out. That means if it means going to the person that is above the person that you spoke to, going to your HR professional, maybe talking to, if you have an employee resource group that focuses on people with visible and invisible disabilities, and getting some other voices along with you that can speak on accessibility and why it's so important. If you need to, hopefully you have a DEI practitioner that's there. If you're doing employee surveys, to make sure that you're typing in those points in, you have to keep speaking up for yourself and for others, because unfortunately, I know from the side of speaking with the C-suite, C-level people, they feel like, oh, if I haven't heard about it, it's not a problem. If it hasn't made it to me, then it's not a problem. And even for me saying, no, this is a problem. We need something that we can add closed captions to, because for our people that are hearing impaired, or have, you know, learning disabilities, these things. And they're like, well, nobody's complained about it. We need those numbers behind us. We need those numbers of saying, no, this is important. And it can get tiring and it can get daunting. So you feel like you're constantly having to educate people, you're constantly coming against it. But if we just look at the change that we've had just in the United States, the change that we've had in laws and things like that, it started with people that refused to not be heard and refused to let things continue to go with the status quo. And they identified a change that needs to be made, and they refused to be that person that stopped speaking out for that change. So that means internally, and then also with our local government, because that's a lot of things that changes, you know, with the roads and the fact that that road was not accessible. We need for people to speak up before something bad happens, because a lot of times, unfortunately, inclusion work, belonging work, DEI work is reactionary. And it isn't until something really bad happens that people feel like they're being forced in their hand to make those changes. And we need for the most of us to stand up and say, this road is not good. Before someone gets hurt, we need to come together and say, this isn't good. These closed captions are not enough. These accessibility options for our Google Suite is not enough. And just keep fighting the good fight. Even when you get tired, take a mindfulness session with Shawnta, get rejuvenated, and then get right back up to continue fighting.
Right. Speaking along that, what is your advice, I guess, for nonprofits? You know, we have a lot of nonprofits here that we're serving, and funding is limited, not using that as an excuse, but what would you advise them to do when they're trying to be accessible to others and just making sure we can accommodate all those we can with the resources that we do have?
I think, Milan, the answer to that is that accessibility is not expensive. It is very reasonable, whatever it might be. Whether when we look at it from a positive spin, I can share with you that what Tavon just mentioned, closed captioning. I use closed captioning all the time on television because I can listen better to that. So if whether you do it for one person, actually the cost of providing that accessibility is spread over to all your organization, all your employees, and it will benefit everybody. So the cost of accessibility is not expensive. So anybody who's using that route, I would refrain from doing that. It is good for everyone.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think not-for-profits just have to be prepared. One of the greatest motivators to stay in a state of avoidance is past failures. One of them. There's obviously more, right? There's many reasons why they develop a certain fear or phobia of something, but certain past failures can certainly lead as a high motivator as to why you don't want to venture to allowing someone the opportunity of employment inside of your workspace because of a certain disability. But you got to be prepared. We've got to hold that into an understanding of whether it's budget, whether it's laws or bylaws. I live in New York City. I'm not in Atlanta like everyone else. However, we are blessed in New York City to have a city, at least, if not the state, but certainly the city, that certainly makes no bones about making protective classes and expanding what protections mean, right? Social protections, workplace protections, housing protections, and what that means across the sphere of this city. However, one thing is to espouse that value, and another thing is to actually do it and commit to making sure that people live within the construct of what that protection means to them. And I think that's where HRs are very integral. In any not-for-profit or for-profit, but since we are definitely servicing a lot of not-for-profits here in this audience, I myself work in a not-for-profit and have worked for many not-for-profits in years past. It's very important to understand that you have to plan ahead. And I think, Tavon, I think you hit something where it's very reactionary instead of, on top of it or actionary. Don't let it be reactionary. Be on top of the conversation of the disability, impairment, and workforce right, workplace right that a person has right from the start, right from the very beginning. You look at your policies, you tie that together with your city, state, and federal laws. Educate yourself and understanding, align yourself with other allies within the organization. Understand that the conversation has a far reach and a far broader breadth than maybe you can even understand until you start to hold the topic at hand. And certainly it does take a lot to do so, because you can get a lot of dissenters. You can get a lot of folks who are either turned off by it or maybe just say no. In a lot of ways in the not-for-profit world, you could easily start resorting to answers being budgetary, or we don't have the financial means. Those are all just on the surface excuses, because what you see as a disability, I can tell you that what you don't see is a vast majority of people who are in that workspace accommodating for themselves for the disabilities that they have each and every day, despite their relationships with their leaders, with their supervisors, and their managers. So for not-for-profits, you have to stay in front of that conversation. It is a very important factor of success, of outright response, and a responsibility that you have, because all not-for-profits service other communities in need. Some sort of marginalization is being resourced inside of each and every one of our not-for-profits. So you're in the front of that conversation to begin with. So don't let it falter here. And I would say just be prepared. Don't be a victim of avoidance because of past failures.
Thank you, everybody. I know we're like over time now, and I know everyone has other commitments. We so appreciate your time.